The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole station clearing its throat. I was standing at the west viewport of the Calais outpost, when every human transponder in the network dropped off the board at the same moment. Not one by one, not in a wave. All of them, together, like someone had reached out and switched off a light that had been burning for 40 years. My name is Grace Doyle. I was the last human liaison officer left speaking to the Galactic Council, and on that morning, I watched my entire species disappear from every screen in the building. Noah Price came running down the corridor with his tablet still open, the numbers scrolling too fast to read. Grace, look at this. I'm looking at it. No signal, no relay ping, no colony beacon, nothing from Earth, nothing from the Kestrel line, nothing from the shipyards at Anchor Point. It's not jamming. Jamming leaves a shadow. This is just gone. I did not answer him right away. I was doing the thing I had trained myself to do for years, which was to feel the fear arrive and then set it down somewhere quiet, so it would not show on my face. The council had eyes everywhere on this outpost, in the walls, in the air vents, in the polite little translator drones that hovered near every doorway pretending to be furniture. I could not afford to look afraid. Not yet. Get me Chancellor Sol, I said. He's already on his way. Grace. The delegates are saying humanity ran. They're saying we lost our nerve and pulled every ship home to hide. Let them say that. You don't think we should correct them? I looked at the dead board one more time. 40 years of joint patrols, trade routes, shared border stations, all of it reduced to a wall of gray dots that used to be green. I think, I said, that whoever believes we ran is about to have a very bad year. Chancellor Edrin Sol arrived with 4 of his aides trailing behind him like a comet's tail, each one holding a different device, each one talking over the others. Sol was tall in the way his people were always tall, built like something poured rather than born, with skin the color of wet slate and eyes that never quite settled on one point. Liaison Doyle, he said, I require an explanation. I don't have one. Your government has abandoned every post along the Kestrel corridor, 17 joint installations, 12,000 personnel, human and otherwise. Do you understand what that leaves undefended? I understand it better than you do. That stopped him for a second. Sol was not used to being interrupted, and he liked it even less when the interruption was true. Then you will contact your command and demand an explanation, he said. The council cannot function with a hole this size torn out of the frontier. I've tried. Every channel is dark, not disconnected, not destroyed, dark, like someone closed a door and is standing on the other side of it, not answering. That is not possible for a species with your government's limited relay infrastructure. I almost laughed. Limited. That was the word they always used for us, right up until the year they stopped being able to use it and started pretending they never had. Chancellor, I've been standing in these halls for 6 years, telling your committees that humanity plays by different rules than you assume. Every time, someone smiles and writes it down as a cultural quirk. I am telling you now, for the last time I intend to say it politely. This was not an accident, and it was not weakness. This was a decision. A decision to abandon your allies. A decision to stop asking for something you were never going to give us. He studied me. I have watched Edrin Sol read a room of 40 delegates and correctly guess which 3 were lying before they opened their mouths. He was doing that to me now, and for the first time in 6 years, I let him see all of it. The tiredness. The grief underneath the calm. I did not hide it, because hiding it would have told him it wasn't real. He believed me. I watched the belief land on him like a weight he had not budgeted for. There will be a full session within the hour, he said. The Fleet Command Wing is already proposing an envoy. You should be present. I intend to be. He left with his aides scrambling to keep pace, and Noah exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the alarm went off. An envoy, he said. They're going to send ships after an empty house. It's not empty. Grace, there's nothing on the boards. No fleet signatures, no colony traffic, nothing. That's what they want you to see. I walked to the window instead of answering the question underneath his question, which was the same one I had been carrying since the moment the alarm sounded. Where did we go? And more than that, what did we finally decide we were allowed to become, once nobody was left to tell us not to? Outside the viewport, the callous system turned the way it always had, slow and patient. 3 moons, stitched across a violet sky, that had nothing to do with any of this. Somewhere past the edge of what the Council's sensors could reach, human space sat quiet behind a border nobody had drawn yet. I did not know what waited there. I had not been home in 3 years, but I knew the people who built that silence, and I knew they did not build anything by accident. The full session started an hour later in the Central Assembly, a chamber shaped like an open hand, with delegate stations rising in tiers around a floor built for arguments that were supposed to sound civilized. I sat in the human seat, which nobody had bothered to remove yet, though I suspected that would change soon enough. Fleet Commodore Voss Keel opened the session standing, which was a breach of protocol he clearly did not care about. 17 installations, he said. Gone dark within a single rotation. This is not withdrawal, this is preparation. Preparation for what? Asked a delegate from the reptilian trade bloc, her voice flat with the particular boredom of someone who had survived worse crises than this one. For whatever comes next, Keel said. I move that we send a diplomatic and reconnaissance fleet to the edge of former human territory. Non-aggressive posture, full sensor suite. We determine intent before this becomes something none of us can walk back. And if there is no intent to determine, Saul said from the chair, because there is no one left there to hold one, then we will have wasted a patrol, Keel said. If I am wrong about the alternative, we will have wasted considerably more than that. The vote took 11 minutes. I did not speak during any of it, because nobody asked me to, and because I had already said everything I planned to say to Sol in the hallway. When the vote passed, Keel looked down from the fleet tier directly at me, the way a man looks at the only person in the room who might actually know what he was walking into. Liaison Doyle, he said, you have been unusually quiet. I've said what I know. Then say what you suspect. The whole chamber went still. In the particular way, rooms go still, when they realize the person speaking might be the only honest one left in it. I suspect, I said, that you are about to fly a fleet up to the front door of a house where every light is off, and knock, expecting the people inside to be as frightened of the dark as you are. And if they are not frightened, then I hope your ships are faster than your pride, Commodore, because pride is the only thing that fleet is bringing home. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued either. Keel held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, like a man filing something away for later use, and gave the order to prepare his ships within the day. I went back to my quarters that night and sat with the last message I had ever received from home, 3 years old now, a short line from my brother telling me to keep my head down and trust nothing the council said about troop movements. I had read it so many times the words had stopped meaning anything and started meaning everything at once. I did not sleep. I sat by the window and watched Keel's fleet assemble in the dock below, 7 ships gleaming under work lights, crews moving with the brisk confidence of people who had never once been told no by something they could not out-argue. I thought about all the things the council had filed away over the decades without reading past the first page. The old contact reports, the analysts who warned, quietly and then more loudly, that humanity's peace was a policy and not a limitation. The footnotes nobody opened, because the summary above them was easier to believe. I thought about my brother, wherever he was now, and the 4 words in his last message that I had never once repeated to anyone in this building, not even Sol, not even under oath. We are not hiding. Outside, Keel's fleet finished its final systems check and began its slow turn toward the dark edge of the frontier, 7 bright hulls sliding out past the outpost lights and into a silence that had been building, patiently, for longer than any of them understood. I watched until the last ship cleared the dock, and then I turned away from the window, because I already knew, better than anyone in that assembly hall, exactly what kind of silence they were flying into. Commodore Keel's fleet crossed the marked border 11 days later, and I was not there to see it happen. I was 3 systems away, sitting in a windowless briefing room, while a committee of trade delegates asked me questions they had already decided the answers to. Explain the resource stockpiling patterns, said a delegate named Orsa Thane, tapping a datapad that showed human shipping logs going back 6 months. Grain surpluses, fabrication metals, medical stock, tripled in volume. This is not the behavior of a species preparing to talk. It's the behavior of a species preparing, I said. You're right about that much. Preparing for war. Preparing to survive one, if one comes looking. There's a difference, and your committee has never once bothered to learn it. Thane did not like that answer. Nobody on the committee did. I had given variations of it 11 times that week, to 11 different rooms, and I had begun to understand that none of them were listening for information anymore. They were listening for permission to be afraid, or permission not to be, and I could not give either one honestly. Noah found me afterward in the corridor outside, holding his tablet against his chest, like it might run away from him. Keel's fleet reached the edge of the old Kestrel corridor 2 hours ago, he said. They're inside what used to be human territory. And nothing. That's the thing. Nothing's happening. No response, no contact, no ships. Keel's sending back status pings every 20 minutes, and they all say the same word. Clear. It's not clear. How do you know that? I didn't answer him right away, because the honest answer was that I didn't know anything for certain anymore, not the way I used to when I still had a working line home. What I had instead was 6 years of watching how humanity behaved when it thought no one council side was paying attention, and a lifetime before that of growing up inside a culture that had learned, the hard way, twice, what it cost to look weak in front of people who mistook kindness for an absence of teeth. Because empty rooms don't get maintained, I said. And that corridor has been maintained. I've seen the sensor ghosts in the old joint logs. Something's been running defense grid diagnostics out there every 6 weeks, like clockwork for the last 3 years. Ghosts don't run diagnostics, Noah. He went quiet at that, the particular quiet of a young man realizing the floor under him might not be as solid as advertised. Then why isn't anything shooting at Keel? Because shooting at him would be a message. And right now, nobody back home wants to send one yet. We got the first real report 6 hours later, relayed through 3 different systems before it reached Callus, degraded enough that half the data had to be reconstructed by the outpost's analysts. I read it twice before I let myself believe it. Keel's fleet had reached the coordinates of what used to be Anchor Point Station, once a joint human council shipyard, now catalogued as abandoned. It was not abandoned. It was dark, powered down to the barest maintenance threshold, every visible system reading cold, and completely, perfectly intact. No damage, no decay, no sign that anyone had left in a hurry. It looked, Keel's own report said, like a house where the owners had simply gone out for the evening and left every door locked behind them. Then, 4 hours into the survey, something changed. I was in the analyst's bay when the alert came through. A cluster of council technicians hunched over 3 overlapping displays, arguing in 2 languages at once about what they were looking at. I pushed my way to the center console and read it myself. A single vessel had appeared on Keel's long-range scans. No emissions signature beforehand, no approach vector logged. It was simply there, sitting at the exact midpoint between Keel's flagship and the dead shipyard, close enough that its presence could not be a coincidence, and far enough that it could not be mistaken for an attack posture. What is it? I asked. Classification. The lead analyst, a narrow-faced man named Petar Aldis, who had spent 4 years cataloging human technology for the Council's archives, shook his head slowly. It doesn't match anything in the registry. Hull profile is consistent with human design philosophy, but the drive signature is nothing we've ever logged. No weapons ports visible. No shields active, as far as we can tell. Unarmed, Thane said, arriving behind me with 2 aides in tow. 1 unarmed vessel against a 7-ship fleet. That's not a threat. That's a suicide. Or it's not trying to threaten anyone, I said. Aldis pulled up the transmission log. Commodore Keel hailed it 3 times. No response on any channel. Then, he stopped. Then what? Thane said. Then Keel's entire sensor suite went dark. All 7 ships. Simultaneously. Not damaged. Just off. Like someone reached across 400,000 kilometers of open space and switched a light off in someone else's house. The room went silent, the way rooms do when a fact refuses to be argued with. I thought about my own words to Keel, 11 days earlier, in the assembly chamber. I hope your ships are faster than your pride. I had not expected to be proven right this quickly, and there was no satisfaction in it at all, only a cold, settling certainty that the version of humanity I had spent 6 years defending to a room full of skeptics was smaller than the version that had just gone quiet on the far side of an empty shipyard. Keel's fleet held position for 11 hours. The single vessel did not move, did not fire, did not send a single transmission on any frequency the Council's instruments could detect. It simply sat there, a closed door with nothing written on it, until, according to the recovered flight logs, Keel gave the order to withdraw. Nobody in the assembly wanted to call it a retreat. The official language, when the report finally reached Callus, used the word disengagement, which was the kind of word committees invent specifically so they never have to say the true one out loud. Sol summoned me 2 days after Keel's fleet limped back across the border, sensor arrays still dead, crews reportedly rattled in a way none of them would describe on record. His office was smaller than the assembly chamber, quieter, lit by the soft gray light his species preferred, and for the first time since I had known him, he did not have 4 aides standing behind his shoulder. "I have read the reports," he said. "I have also read the version Commodore Keel gave verbally, which does not match the written one in several places." What did he leave out? He said the ship did not merely disable his sensors. He said it felt as though it had chosen, precisely, exactly how much of his fleet's capability to remove, and no more. Not a full disabling, a demonstration. I let that sit for a moment. "That sounds like restraint to me," I said. "It sounds," Sol said, "like a species showing us the very edge of a much larger circle, and daring us to ask how big the rest of it is." He slid a datapad across the table toward me. On it was a single line of text, forwarded through 6 relays, badly degraded, the kind of transmission that should not have been able to survive that many jumps intact. "This arrived at the Callus relay 40 minutes ago," Sol said, "addressed, specifically, to you." I picked it up with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be. The message was short, 4 words, the same shape as the ones my brother had sent me 3 years earlier, though I did not recognize the sender code, and never would find out, in all the months that followed, exactly who on the other end had chosen to send it. "Tell them we're listening." I did not tell Sol what it said. I told him 4 words of something else entirely, a decoy sentence, close enough to plausible that he would not press further, and watched him accept it, the way a man accepts a story he has already decided he does not have the strength to fully investigate. That night I sat alone in my quarters with the real message open in front of me, and I understood, in a way I had not quite let myself understand before, that humanity had not gone quiet because it had nothing left to say. It had gone quiet because it had finally run out of patience for saying things to people who never once wrote down the answer. Over the following weeks, the Council's committees did exactly what committees do when they are frightened and cannot admit it. They argued. They formed subcommittees to study the subcommittees. Analysts pulled every scrap of historical data on humanity they could find, decades of first contact reports, trade negotiation transcripts, old joint exercise logs, and began combing through them with the kind of urgency that should have existed decades earlier and never had. I was called in 11 more times to explain things I had already explained. I answered every question honestly, which is to say I answered every question in a way that was true, and told them almost nothing, because the truth, spoken plainly enough, would have frightened them worse than any lie I could have constructed. Noah began sitting with me during the long hours between sessions, and one evening, in the empty observation lounge overlooking the outpost dock, he asked me the question everyone else had been too careful to ask directly. "Are we going to go to war with them, Grace?" "No," I said. "How do you know?" "Because if they wanted a war, Keel's fleet wouldn't have come home." He turned that over for a while, watching the dock lights flicker against the dark hull of a council cruiser undergoing repair. "Then what do they want?" I said, "they want to be left alone by people who never once asked what that would cost them not to have. And I think they've decided that if nobody was going to give it to them freely, they were going to take it, quietly, without asking permission from a committee that would have argued about it for 11 years. That's not an answer to a diplomat, Grace. That's grief." I looked at him for a long moment. Noah Price was 26 years old, born on a council world, raised on a diet of humanity described in footnotes and cultural briefings, that had never once captured what it actually felt like to be from a species that had spent its entire short history in these halls, being tolerated rather than heard. It's both, I said. It usually is. 3 days later, the Council received its second transmission from human space, this one not addressed to me, but broadcast openly on every diplomatic channel at once, brief enough that no committee had time to argue about how to interpret it before the entire assembly had already read it for themselves. It did not threaten anyone. It did not demand anything. It simply stated, in plain and unremarkable language, that any vessel crossing the marked border of human space without prior contact, through the single relay station now designated for that purpose, would be treated according to protocols humanity was, for the first time in its history among the stars, no longer willing to explain in advance. Fleet Commodore Keel read that message standing in the same assembly chamber where he had once demanded a reconnaissance fleet within the day. This time, he did not ask for a vote. He asked, instead, for the chamber to adjourn, and for the first time in 6 years, nobody argued with him. I walked out of that session into the observation corridor and stood at the long viewport where I had first watched Keel's fleet assemble and thought about the 4 words still sitting, unanswered, on the data pad in my quarters. Tell them we're listening. I did not yet know what I was supposed to tell them back. I only knew, standing there while the assembly dispersed in a hush that had nothing to do with relief, that whatever answer I eventually gave was going to matter more than anything I had said in the 6 long years before it. The relay station humanity built was not on any council map, and that alone told me more than any briefing could have. It appeared 8 days after the open broadcast, a modest structure by the standards of anything the council usually built, hanging at the precise midpoint between the old Kestrel corridor and the nearest council-controlled system. No weapons emplacements visible, no fleet screen, just a single relay, blinking patiently, waiting for someone to use it the way it had been designed to be used. Saul asked me to be the one to make first contact through it, and I did not need to ask him why. 6 years of sitting in rooms explaining humanity to people who had never once tried to understand it on its own terms had made me, without my ever choosing it, the only bridge still standing. I sat alone in a communications booth on Callus, with Noah, watching through the observation glass, my hand hovering over the transmit key longer than I wanted to admit. You don't have to do this alone, Noah said through the intercom. Yes, I do. I opened the channel. This is Grace Doyle, I said. Liaison, Galactic Council, Gallice Outpost. I'm requesting contact. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. I counted every one of them. Then a voice answered. Male, calm, with an accent I placed immediately as belonging to the eastern coastal provinces back home, the kind of voice I had not heard spoken aloud in 3 years. Liaison Doyle, stand by. The wait after that lasted almost 2 minutes, long enough that Saul's aides outside the booth had begun to whisper among themselves before the channel opened again, and a second voice came through, one I recognized instantly, one that made my hands go still on the console in front of me. Grace. Daniel. My brother's voice had not changed in 3 years, though something underneath it had, a steadiness that had not been there before, or had been there, and I had simply never had reason to hear it. You're alive, he said. Good. That's good. You could have told me that 11 days ago, instead of letting me watch a council fleet limp home half-blind. I couldn't. I'm sorry. It wasn't my call to make. Whose call was it? There was a pause, the kind that told me more than any answer would have. That's not something I can say over an open relay, even one we built. I need you to trust that for now. Trust has been in short supply out here, Daniel. I know. That's why I asked for you specifically. Noah's voice crackled faintly through the intercom behind me. Quiet. Careful. Grace, Sol wants to know if this is an official channel of state. I ignored him for the moment and kept my focus on the voice from home, the first true one I had heard in 3 years, carrying more weight in 11 words than every assembly session I had sat through since the silence began. Daniel, tell me what happened to Keel's fleet. They crossed a line we'd marked and never bothered to check what marking it meant. The response was proportional. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was going to be. Proportional. That's a word from a manual, not a man. He exhaled, and for the first time the calm cracked. Just slightly. Just enough for me to hear the brother underneath the voice. You want the manual version, or the real one? The real one. The real one is that we spent 40 years being useful to people who never once asked what it cost us to keep being useful. Every ship, every soldier, every colony, we opened up along that corridor. Council use first, human benefit somewhere down the list, if there was room left over. We tried the patient way for 2 generations, Grace. You know that better than almost anyone alive, because you're the one who's spent 6 years standing in rooms trying to make them listen. I know. So we stopped asking. That's all this is. We stopped asking, and it turns out we didn't need anyone's permission to stop. I closed my eyes for a moment, the booth around me suddenly very small, very far from home in a way it had not felt in years, though nothing about the room had changed. And now, I said, what happens now? Now the council gets to decide whether it wants a relationship with us, built on something other than usefulness. That's the whole message, Grace. That's what I need you to carry back to them, because it's not going to land the same way coming from anyone else. They're not going to like that answer. They don't have to like it. They just have to understand it's the only one on offer. The channel held another long silence, and in it I found myself thinking not about Soul, not about Keel, not about the assembly waiting outside the booth for a transcript they would spend the next month arguing over, but about the 4 words I had never repeated to anyone. Daniel. Who sent the message? Tell them we're listening. Another pause, longer this time. That was me, he said. I wanted you to know, before any of this got formal, that it was never about shutting you out. We needed the silence to hold long enough to mean something. If we'd kept one channel open for family, it would have leaked, and the whole thing would have collapsed into exactly the kind of half measure that's gotten us nowhere for 40 years. I'm sorry it had to include you. I did not answer right away, because the honest answer would have needed more room than the channel had. More room than either of us had, standing on opposite sides of a decision neither of us had been allowed to make together. I forgive you, I said finally. That doesn't mean I'm not angry. I'd be worried if you weren't. We spoke for another 20 minutes after that, most of it practical. Relay protocols, the shape of the single approved contact point, the narrow list of things humanity was willing to discuss, and the much longer list it was not. And by the end of it, I had enough for a report that would occupy the assembly for weeks, though none of what mattered most would appear in any official transcript. When the channel finally closed, I sat in the booth for a long time before I opened the door, long enough that Noah eventually knocked. Grace, you okay? I'm fine. You don't sound fine. I looked up at him, and I let him see it, the same way I had let Soul see it 11 days earlier in the hallway outside the assembly, because hiding it now would only have made the next part harder. My brother just told me humanity spent 2 generations trying to be understood the polite way, I said, and that it finally decided the polite way wasn't going to work, so it built a different one, without telling anyone, including me. How do you feel about that? Proud, I said, and furious. At the same time, in the same breath. I don't think those are supposed to fit together, but apparently they do. Soul received my report the following morning, and for once he read it in silence from beginning to end, without interrupting, without his usual habit of pausing to ask clarifying questions, 3 sentences, before I had finished answering the last one. When he finally looked up, his expression was harder to read than usual, the particular stillness of a man recalculating something he had assumed was fixed. They are asking us to renegotiate everything, he said. 40 years of shared infrastructure, joint fleets, trade corridors, all of it, from a position where we hold nothing they need, and they hold everything we relied on, without ever fully admitting it. That's the situation, yes. And you believe this was planned? Not a breakdown, a plan. I believe humanity spent longer preparing this exit than most of your committees have spent debating whether it's real. Soul set the report down slowly. There will be delegates who want to punish this. Sanctions. A formal condemnation. An attempt to isolate whatever remains of human trade, to force a renegotiation on our terms instead of theirs. They can try. You don't think it would work? I think, I said, that a species which just proved it could disable a council fleet without firing a single shot is not going to be moved by a strongly worded resolution. He was quiet for a long moment, looking past me toward the window, where the same 3 moons that had watched Keel's fleet depart 11 days ago now turned in exactly the same slow, indifferent orbit, unbothered by anything that had happened in between. "I have sat on this council for 31 years, Liaison Doyle," he said. "I have watched a dozen species rise and posture, and eventually settle into whatever role the balance of power assigned them. I did not expect humanity to be the one that simply declined to accept the role it had been assigned, without ever announcing it was declining." "That's the part nobody read in the footnotes," I said. "We were never going to ask permission to stop being useful on someone else's terms. We just took longer than everyone else to reach the point where we finally didn't have to." He did not answer that. He simply nodded, once, the way a man nods when he has finally understood a sentence he has been mistranslating for decades. And I left his office knowing that the real negotiation, the one that would decide what humanity's place in this galaxy actually became, had not yet begun. It was only starting now, in the quiet after the silence, where every word would finally have to mean exactly what it said. The old records surfaced 3 weeks later, and they should have surfaced 40 years earlier. It was Petar Aldous who found them, buried in an archive wing so rarely visited that half its index files had never been converted to the Council's current search protocols. He came to my quarters late one evening, out of breath, carrying a data case like it might shatter if he set it down too hard. "You need to see this," he said. "All of it, before it goes anywhere near the assembly." He laid the files out across my table, dozens of them, dated back to the earliest years of Council contact with Earth, decades before I was born. Committee minutes, analyst assessments, transcripts of hearings so old the recording equipment had degraded half the audio into static. "This is the original contact assessment," he said, tapping the first file. "Written by a survey team 8 years after first contact. Read the summary." I read it. Then I read it again, slower, because the first pass had not let the words sink in properly. "Human society demonstrates a documented historical capacity for coordinated large-scale conflict, exceeding that of any currently catalogued council species. However, current behavioral patterns suggest this capacity is actively and consistently suppressed through deliberate cultural and political mechanisms, not through incapability. Recommend continued monitoring of the underlying capacity, rather than reliance on current peaceful conduct as a permanent condition." "They knew," I said quietly. 8 years in, they knew, and they wrote it down. "It gets worse," Aldous said, sliding the next file toward me. "This is the follow-up assessment, filed 11 years later, after the Joint Fleet Agreements were signed." Someone tried to raise the same concern again. The second file was shorter, colder, the kind of document written by someone who already knew nobody above them wanted to hear what it said. "Analyst recommendation to revisit human capacity assessment has been noted and archived. Executive summary from the original 8-year report has been retained in all subsequent briefing materials. Full report has not. No further action recommended at this time." "They kept the summary," I said, "and buried the part that actually mattered, because the summary was easier," Aldous said. "The summary said humans were useful, cooperative, technologically capable, but militarily unremarkable. That's the version every committee for the last 3 decades has built policy on." Nobody ever went back and read past the first page, because the first page told them exactly what they wanted to believe. I sat back, the weight of it settling into my chest slowly, the way grief does when it arrives without warning in the middle of something that had nothing to do with grief at all. 40 years, I said. 40 years of us being catalogued as unremarkable, right up until the moment we stopped being willing to prove it. "There's one more," Aldous said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way I had not heard from him before. "This one isn't a council document. It's a personal log, filed by the original survey team's lead analyst before she retired. It was never meant to reach the archive at all. I think it ended up here by accident." He handed it to me last, and I understood, reading the first line, why he had saved it for the end. "I have spent 11 years trying to convince this body that peace, when it is chosen rather than imposed, can be unchosen with the same deliberation it was granted. Nobody wants to hear that a species capable of extraordinary restraint might one day simply run out of reasons to keep extending it. I am retiring without having said this loudly enough, and I suspect that failure will belong to someone else. decades from now, who will have to learn it the hard way that I tried to spare them. I set the file down and did not speak for a long time. She saw this coming, I said finally, decades before it happened, and nobody listened to her either. No, Aldous said, they didn't. I brought all 3 files to the assembly the next day, and for the first time since the silence began, I did not stand at the human liaison seat waiting to be questioned. I stood at the center of the chamber floor, the way Fleet Commodore Keel had once stood to open a session, and I did not wait for permission to speak. 6 weeks ago, I said, this body demanded to know why humanity left without a word. I've come to answer that question properly, and I want every delegate in this room to understand that the answer was sitting in your own archive the entire time. I read the first assessment aloud, all of it, not the summary but the full document, the parts that had been quietly filed away and never revisited. I watched delegates who had spent 6 years asking me polite, condescending questions about human military capability sit in a silence that had nothing polite left in it. You were told, I said, 8 years into contact, that our restraint was a choice and not a limitation. You were told again, 3 years later, and you archived the warning and kept only the flattering summary, because the summary made your policy easier to write. For 40 years, this council built its entire relationship with humanity on a document it had already been warned not to trust. Chancellor Sol did not interrupt me, neither did Keel, seated in the fleet tier, his expression unreadable, in a way I had never seen from him before. You want to know why we left without a word, I said. Because we tried, for 2 generations, giving you the word first. Warnings, petitions, analysts on your own side, writing reports that told you exactly what was coming, and watching you file them under footnotes because the footnote was easier to live with than the truth. We didn't leave without a word, Chancellor. We left after decades of words that were never once read past the first page. The chamber held its silence for a long moment after I finished, the kind of silence that comes not from having nothing to say, but from finally understanding that nothing said now would undo what had already been true for 40 years. It was Saul who finally spoke, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual formal weight. Liaison Doyle, what does humanity want from this council now? I had turned that question over in my mind every night for 3 weeks, ever since the channel with Daniel had closed, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. I don't think humanity wants anything from this council anymore, Chancellor. I think that's the entire point you're all still struggling to accept. We're not negotiating from a position of need. We're negotiating from a position of choice. And every year this council spent treating us as useful, rather than equal, is a year we're no longer willing to spend earning back. Then what is left to discuss? Whether you want a relationship with a species that no longer requires your approval to exist, or whether you'd rather spend the next 40 years finding out what happens when that species finally stops offering you the choice at all. Nobody in the chamber answered that question that day. It would take weeks of closed sessions, quiet negotiations conducted through the single relay Daniel had built, and a slow, uncomfortable reckoning inside a council that had never once had to admit it was wrong about anything, for any real answer to take shape. But I had said what needed saying, finally, in the one room where it had always mattered most and never once been heard, and when I stepped down from the chamber floor, I did not feel triumphant. I felt only the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a truth alone for far too long, finally setting it down where other people could see its full weight for themselves. Aldous found me afterward in the corridor, the old files still tucked under his arm. You didn't have to do that, he said. You could have kept those files quiet. Let the negotiations happen without dragging 40 years of council failure into the open. I know. Why didn't you? I thought about the analyst who had retired without being heard loudly enough, and the warning she had left behind for someone else to carry, decades later, in a room she would never see. Because someone tried to tell them the truth once already, I said, and it got buried. I wasn't going to let that happen twice. The negotiations lasted 4 months, and I sat through nearly all of them, though very little of what mattered happened in the rooms with the tall ceilings and the recorded transcripts. The real work happened through the relay Daniel had built. In short, careful exchanges between myself and a rotating handful of voices from home, who never gave me their full names and never needed to. What emerged slowly, was not a treaty in the old sense. It was something narrower, colder in places, warmer in others than anything the Council had signed in decades. A single point of contact, a short list of shared concerns, and an explicit, unapologetic understanding that humanity would decide, on its own terms, how much of itself it chose to show the rest of the galaxy going forward. Fleet Commodore Keel came to see me once, near the end of it, in the quiet observation lounge where Noah and I had spent so many long evenings watching the dock lights flicker. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble, which was unlike him. "For what?" "For assuming a species that chose peace for 2 generations had simply forgotten how to choose anything else. You're not the only one who made that mistake, Commodore." "No," he said, "but I was the one standing on the bridge when the lesson arrived. I'd like you to know I've read the full assessment now. All of it. Not just the summary. That's more than most of your colleagues can say." He was quiet for a moment, watching a repair crew work on the hull of the same cruiser that had sat in dock since Keel's fleet limped home 4 months earlier. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think humanity wanted to become something the rest of us should fear. I think it simply stopped being willing to be something we could take for granted. That's closer to the truth than anything I heard in the assembly this year." He nodded, and left without saying anything further, and I understood that whatever came next between the Council and the species he had once flown a fleet against, it would not be built on the old assumptions. Not this time. I was offered a formal seat, in the final weeks, on a newly created Council commission dedicated entirely to human relations, a body that would have been unthinkable 8 months earlier, when I was still the last human voice in a chamber that mostly tolerated my presence rather than valued it. Sol offered it to me himself, in his office, with none of his usual aides standing behind him. "It is, I recognize, decades too late to matter to the people who needed it to exist when the silence began," he said, "but it exists now. That's the trouble with commissions, Chancellor. They only ever get built after the thing they were meant to prevent has already happened. Will you accept the seat regardless?" I did not answer him that day. I told him I needed time, and he gave it to me without argument, which itself told me how much the last 4 months had changed him. I spent that evening at the relay booth instead, the same one where I had first heard Daniel's voice after 3 years of silence, and I opened the channel one more time, not for official business, but because I needed to hear it from someone who had known me before any of this began. "Grace," Daniel said, when the connection settled, "you sound tired." "I am tired. They offered you the commission seat." "How did you know that?" "Because it's the obvious move, and because I know you're the kind of person who'll spend a week deciding whether accepting it means forgiving 40 years of being ignored, or just being practical about the next 40. I laughed quietly, the first real laugh I'd allowed myself in longer than I wanted to admit. You always did know me better than I know myself. Not better, just from a little further away. Sometimes that's the only advantage. Distance is good for. "Do you think I should take it?" He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear, faintly, some ordinary sound behind him. Footsteps, a door, the small, unremarkable noise of a life continuing somewhere I could not see. "I think," he said, "that the seat isn't really the question. The question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life being the bridge, Grace. Not whether you're capable of it. You've already proven that. More than proven it. The question is whether it's still the thing you want to be." I thought about Aldous and his buried files, about the analyst who retired without being heard loudly enough, about Sol's slow, uncomfortable nod in the assembly the day I finally said the thing that needed saying. I thought about Keel's apology, offered without an audience, without anything to gain from it, except the simple discomfort of admitting he'd been wrong. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I know I'm not ready to stop watching this play out. Not after everything it cost to get here. Then don't decide tonight. Decide when you're ready, and not a moment before. Nobody out here is going anywhere. We finally have the room to wait." We spoke a while longer, about smaller things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation two people have when they are finally allowed to simply be siblings again, instead of a liaison and a voice from behind a border. When the channel closed, I sat alone in the booth for a long while, the same way I had 4 months earlier, though the silence around me felt different now, not empty, just unfinished, in the way that all truly important things remain unfinished. waiting for someone to keep choosing them, one day at a time. I did not give Sol my answer the next morning, or the morning after that. I gave it to him 3 weeks later, standing at the same viewport where I had watched Keel's fleet depart all those months ago, the 3 moons of Callus still turning in their slow, indifferent orbit, unbothered by any of it. "I'll take the seat," I told him, "on one condition. Name it. Every report this commission produces gets the full document attached, not just the summary. No footnotes buried, where nobody will read them. If this council is going to build its next 40 years of policy on anything I write, it's going to read every page, whether it wants to or not." Sol considered that for a moment, and then, for the first time since I had known him, he smiled, small, tired, entirely without performance. "Agreed," he said. "It seems this council has finally learned what it costs to skip ahead to the ending." I stood at that window a long while after he left, watching a council patrol rechart a border it had once drawn without ever asking permission, watching human ships move somewhere far beyond the reach of any sensor still catalogued in this outpost's records, and I understood, finally, that the story the galaxy would tell about this year would never quite capture what it had actually cost. Not a war, not a conquest, just a species that had spent 2 generations being patient, and then, quietly, without a single word of warning, had simply stopped, and in that silence, taught an entire galaxy the exact shape of everything it had never bothered to notice it was taking for granted. I did not know, standing there, everything that would come next. I did not know whether the commission I had just agreed to lead would matter, or whether it would become another slow, well-meaning failure like the ones Aldous had shown me buried in the archive. I only knew that I was done being the last voice speaking into a silence nobody believed was real. From now on, whatever humanity chose to say to this galaxy, it would say on its own terms, in its own time, and for the first time in 40 years, every word of it would finally be read, all the way to the end.